Yeah, so this talk is about learning image embeddings for multimodal semantics, as the title says. This is work done together with Léon Bottou at Microsoft Research in New York that I did for an internship over the summer. So as the title says, this fits in the recent trend of multimodal semantics, where the motivation is that human concept acquisition is often grounded in the perceptual system. So we also want to have this in our semantic models. So the approach usually is that people combine linguistic data, you combine it with a perceptual modality, so you can get this from any kind of perceptual data source. People have used property norms or visual input, so that could be just raw image data that you process in a particular way. And then to get, so these multimodal models actually perform better on a variety of tasks than the traditional, like purely linguistic unimodal models. So they're very interesting for studying further. So that's what we've done. You're all familiar with distributional models. I think a couple of years ago, lots of presentations started with a slide like this. So you do a bit of counting in a window, and you get a vector representation in a vector space that gives you the meaning of dog. But what you do in a multimodal distributional model is you take images that these words co-occur with, or any kind of perceptual modality. So you can also use sounds or anything like that. But people tend to use images for this for obvious reasons. It's because they're easily available. So you take images that co-occur for dog, so images that have been tagged with dog, and then you process them in some way to give you a multimodal vector instead of just a linguistic vector. So concretely how this works is people take a linguistic representation, you can use any type of representation for that, and then you take the visual representation and you usually concatenate them. So this concatenation is how you combine it. You can also do more sophisticated ways, but concatenation is what people tend to do. So if you look at this picture, there are three obvious ways to improve it. You either improve how you mix it, which is something that we did at the ACL last conference, or you improve the linguistic representations, which I think is a very active area of research. I think lots of papers at this conference are actually about doing just that. Or you improve the perceptual representation, and that's something that not a lot of people have looked into. So that's exactly what we did. Current multimodal models, they use well-established computer vision techniques, such as SIFT, Scale Invariant Feature Transform, a dense version of that, HOG, FOW, they have all these acronyms for different approaches to get local feature descriptors. But what you do is you identify key points in an image, either by taking a grid or just by really identifying the key points that you are interested in the image. Then you get feature descriptors for all of these key points. Then you cluster them using a standard clustering algorithm, such as k-means or any type of clustering algorithm that you want. And then you quantize them, and what that means is you count all of these clusters and you put them in the appropriate buckets. So it's almost like a histogram, where you take the clusters to be visual words. So it's bag of words, but then in the visual sense. However, as some of you may know, computer vision has since moved on. There's kind of been a revolution going on in computer vision where people have all jumped to convolutional neural networks. So this is a quote from a recent survey paper that says, SIFT and HOG descriptors produced big performance gains a decade ago, and now deep convolutional features are providing a similar breakthrough. So we should move along with the state-of-the-art in computer vision and take this revolution to multimodal semantics as well. So to do that, we use two sources for our images. One is ImageNet. It's well known. It's organized according to the WordNet hierarchy. It's 12.5 million images, 22,000 synsets, and they tend to be very high-quality images. So you can see images here for golden retrievers. So they're always centered and they're very high quality images, which is a nice property to have, but it has very poor coverage, and that's because it's very specific. So it has things like golden retriever, but maybe for like standard things, it doesn't really have very good coverage. And these are the types of things that you would see in semantic relatedness or similarity data sets. And the other data set we use is the ESP game data set. That's derived from the image labeling game with a purpose, as it's called. So two players play against each other in labeling the images. So you get 10 labels for each of the images. It's 100,000 images with 20,000 tags. And these images tend to be lower quality because they've just been like retrieved from the web. But they do have much better coverage because people have actually been labeling this, and people tend to prefer less specific labels, I guess, than if you do it the other way around, which is what they did for ImageNet. Some of these evaluation data sets for semantic similarity, they contain things like entity and animal. So if you want to take images for entity from ImageNet, it's almost impossible because every image in ImageNet is an entity. So what we did is we randomly sample up to 1,000 distinct images of the relevant ImageNet subtree. That's just to make sure that we don't have just a bunch of noise that we introduce without actually being useful. If it's less than 1,000 images, then we increase the coverage by going up in the tree. So we take the hypernym, and then we sample from the subtree of the hypernym. And in order to have a fair comparison, we also did the same sampling procedure for the ESP game dataset. So if a concept has more than 1,000 images, then we sample up to 1,000 for ESP as well. Then onto how we actually get the image representations. So we use a convolutional neural network that has been trained on the ImageNet classification. And this is a version of the Krzyzewski network that you may have heard of, but this is slightly different because it's been trained to do transfer learning, or it's been applied to transfer learning. So it's been trained on ImageNet, but it's been applied on the Pascal VOC challenges from 2007 and 2012. This is work by Maxime Ocap. And this is really the state of the art on this Pascal data set. So what we do there is we do a forward pass. The final layer of this network is a softmax, but we take the layer before this softmax layer, which is a rectified linear unit layer, and then we use this layer as the image embedding. So for each image, we get this image embedding, and then what we do is we aggregate them, and you can think of many different ways to aggregate these image embeddings to get a visual concept embedding. So we experimented with two different possibilities, either taking the mean or taking the max. And then for comparison and kind of as a baseline to see that this actually improves things, we also do bag of visual words, so the standard multimodal approach that people have been using in the past. Then finally, how to get a multimodal representation. So we take the image representation and we concatenate with a linguistic representation. So there's an alpha tuning parameter there that determines how much of which you want to include. So you can kind of tune it a little bit to decide how you want to do your mixing, which is nice to have because sometimes you don't always want to include the visual information. So this diagram shows the whole network. So it's the convolutional neural network at the top. It's been trained on ImageNet. We do a forward pass on that. At the far right there, you see the ImageNet labels. So that's the softmax. So we take the layer before that. So FC7, as it is called in this diagram. So for a word, we select images that are relevant for that word, either from ESP or from ImageNet. Then we do a forward pass in this neural network to get image embeddings for all of these images that are relevant to that word. Then we aggregate them by taking the mean or the max. And then we concatenate that to a linguistic vector. And in this case, we use the state-of-the-art Mikolov model here. So just the skipgram model, because we need linguistic vectors for obvious reasons. Then evaluation. We use two very well-known semantic relatedness data sets. One is MEN, which has the nice benefit that it's actually been constructed with multimodal semantics in mind. So that means that it has full coverage on the ESP game data set. So you're guaranteed to have images available for the words in this data set. But even though it's been constructed with ESP game data set in mind, it hasn't been constructed with ImageNet in mind. So we also take a subset of the MEN evaluation data set that only has the relevant pairs. So where we have full image coverage on both our image sources. And then the other data set is WordSim 353, which is kind of the canonical semantic similarity evaluation data set. Unfortunately, I say here, because there are some idiosyncrasies with WordSim 353, so it's necessary to have it in there for comparison. But there are things like Arafat and Maradona in there, and words that maybe aren't very relevant to these types of semantic comparisons. And it's unclear whether it's about similarity or relatedness. But for this data set, we also took a relevant subset where you have pairs that have image coverage on both our image sources. So going to the results, this is a big table. These are the linguistic representations. So this is purely linguistic, just using the Mikolov model. And then for both our image sources, we compute these visual representations. And as you can tell here, for men relevant, ImageNet actually outperforms the linguistic representation. So that means that the visual representations are already better than the standard linguistic embeddings. And then, of course, the most important part is this. So when you combine it into a multimodal representation using these convolutional neural network embeddings, then you outperform linguistic by a lot, and you also outperform the standard multimodal by a lot. So that means that when you have higher quality image representations, you improve the multimodal representations, and as you can see, that gives you very good numbers. A little bit about that tuning parameter that I talked about earlier, this alpha, so you can tweak how much of which you want to include, how much of which modality. So if you look at these pictures, here at the top left is the full men data set, and at the top right is the relevant subset of men. And as you can see, for the convolutional neural nets, you kind of get a bell shape. And that's what you want, because that means that as you introduce both the modalities, the performance improves. So that means that both of them actually contribute a lot of information to getting a higher quality embedding. Then a little bit about the contribution of image data itself. So like I said, the ESP game data set, it's images that have been labeled with up to 10 words. So there could also just be correlation between the words in the labels. So what you want to, the question you want to ask is the performance increase in these multimodal models, is it due to overlapping word labels? Or maybe because things tend to co-occur together in images very often for some reason? Or is it actually due to the image data that you're using? And the answer that we can give now is that it's due to the images, because we use a different data set than the ESP game data set. And we also see a performance boost. And when we use higher quality image features on the ESP, so instead of doing bag of visual words, we do these convolutional neural networks, we also see a performance boost without changing any of the labels. So that means that the image data really contributes a lot to the representation quality. Then, so finally, in conclusion, multimodal convolutional neural networks outperform standard multimodal with bag of visual words. And they also outperform the language-only representations. This improvement is due to the image data, like I just said. So that's very nice. In future work, we want to look at the concreteness of the concepts in these data sets. So this previous paper at ACL, we looked at image dispersion for deciding how much visual information you want to include. So for abstract concepts like democracy, you maybe don't want to include image data, but for things like dogs and golden retrievers, you want to do so for obvious reasons. So by playing around with that, you can improve things even further, we think. And another obvious thing to do is to do joint learning of the representations or other mixing strategies to improve things further. If you want to play around with these embeddings, they're available on this website, so you can download them and yeah, start playing around with multimodal models and using image data in your work as well. So that's it. Thank you.
So thank you again. So we have a lot of time for questions.
Hi, nice talk, thanks. I'm just a little bit confused for the evaluation setting. You mean when you combine image and linguistics words together? So when you evaluate how similar an image and a word.
No, how similar the two words are. So these data sets are pairs of words with human similarity judgments. So you have something like cat and tiger, and then a rating that says.
So with image embedding, you improve the result.
Yes.
So okay, the question is, since you now combine the embeddings both from the image part and the words part, so is it possible that you use it for the given word? You use it to search the related images, and given the image, you search for the possible words, expressions for this image.
Yeah, that's possible. So that's cross-modal mappings. So there's been recent work on that. So one obvious way to extend this is to use these convolutional neural net features and to do cross-modal mappings, because that should also yield better results than the standard bag of visual words approach that people have been using.
Okay.
Thanks. It's a very great work and very aggressive to combine the image and text. About the experiments, I have some details not so clear. The first is to have you compared to figure out what's the contribution from the co-occurrence of the words bridged via the image or from the feature of the image. That's the first question.
So you mean what I talked about a bit about the contribution of image data?
Right.
Yeah.
So, you explained it, but I mean, in the experiments, have you compared such kind of experiments that you do not use the same features from the image, but just to take the image as a node or as a word, so they co-occur with the co-occurrent words. So these are experiments.
Interesting idea. So I think there are a lot of possibilities for really evaluating these types of things. So you can construct representations either just from the overlapping word labels or just from the images themselves. That's a good idea.
And the second question is that, so in the experiments, actually you concatenate the vectors from the text and the image.
Yeah.
So when you compare with the baselines, so the dimension of the two vectors are the same?
What do you mean?
I mean, for example, you compare with some baseline of a word embedding.
Yeah.
So for example, the word embedding dimension is 100 dimension.
Yeah. So
and your dimension
is 200 dimensional because
it's 200. So have you compared that with the word embedding with 200 dimensionality?
I haven't. That's a good idea too. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
So did you notice any decrease in performance for some words by including the image data?
So I did a little bit of error analysis. So what you see here at the top is the top 5 best ones and the top 5 worst ones. So some of these, I guess in the MEN data set, you see a clear pattern between the two data sets. So I think, for example, that the linguistic representation for bread isn't very good because you see it in both of them. So I've tried to look into it, but there aren't really that many patterns. I mean, some things are quite obvious, especially in like the words in 353 errors. So because that's such a weird data set in a way, you tend to get really weird errors that are just due to the data set itself. But it's definitely something to look into further.
Okay, I have a very good talk. Thanks. The question is, do you take into consideration the context of the image or of the word? Because now you try to combine the representation of both word and image, right?
Yeah.
So that image can occur in the similar context with different image. Then you can kind of like combine into the context. That's the first thing. The second thing is why 200 dimension? Because neural network can represent things in low dimension things, but because now we're trying to represent image, which is much more complicated than word, then probably more dimension than is more distinguishable.
Right.
And why to not 300? And do you have any experiment
Yeah, so actually I just made a mistake when I said that it's 200 because there's, if you look at this, so this is a 6,144 dimensional feature vector. So they're both normalized, and that's why you can concatenate them. But so your visual vector is, has more components. So that's the answer to your second question. Your first question about the context. So I think you mean when you have overlapping text and image data at the same time. So people have done work on that, but the benefit of taking them from separate sources is that you just have more data available. Otherwise, you really have to rely just on overlapping image and text sources, and of course, they're not very easy to get. So it's just to get more data.
Let's thank the speaker again.